Recap in minutes. In today's video, we will be enjoying a war drama film, based on true events entitled The Full Measure. There will be spoilers ahead, chill out and enjoy. The movie begins with Scott Huffman, a political staffer for the Pentagon, together with his wife and son, were on their way to the hospital for a checkup when they were stuck in heavy traffic. Scott's assistant calls and informs him that a high-ranking official resigned without prior notice. Understanding the situation, Mrs. Huffman instructs his husband to go ahead and use the metro to work. Later, he arrives at the Pentagon and is immediately briefed by his secretary on the day's schedule. He's to meet up with Master Sergeant Thomas Tully. Stanton, Scott's friend and colleague, assigned him the task of investigating a posthumous Medal of Honor request for William Pitsenbarger and getting it over with. Scott reviews the documents and informs Tully that William has already been awarded with the Air Force Cross. Tully justifies that William deserves the Medal of Honor, the highest award that can be given to a serviceman. After the meeting, Tully follows Secretary Peters to the comfort room to talk to him about the case. In all honesty, Scott couldn't give two pieces of his time with the Medal of Honor request. He couldn't gain anything from doing such tedious work. But Secretary Peters has something else in mind. He calls Scott to his office, orders him to collect combat testimonies personally, and prepare a complete decorations review. With not much option, Scott works on the Pitsenbarger case and leaves town. Flashback from the height of the Vietnam War, a company of soldiers patrols the dense jungle when suddenly they are ambushed. A fierce firefight ensues, and after the grunts of the jungle take losses, they radio for an injured evac. Moments later, the rescue helicopter arrives and starts carrying the injured one by one. But it's taking too long since the US soldiers below don't know how to load the litters. Reason for that is because the first wounded on board is the medic. The only person that had training regarding the matter. And so, to speed things up, William Pitsenbarger volunteers to go down and help. At present, Scott first visits the Pitsenbarger together with Master Sergeant Tully. He interviews him about his side of the story. After a brief exchange, William's father, Frank, informs Scott that if he wants the real story in Abilene, he needs to talk to the soldiers there. The surviving members of Charlie Company, 16th Infantry, also known as the Big Red One. Frank suggests that he start with Billy Takota, the lieutenant present at the time. Soon, Scott heads to the rural area an hour away from the Pitsenbarger residence to look for Takota. He goes deep into a forest and follows the pathway on a nearby river. With not a soul in sight, Scott shouts. And it worked. Takota emerges on top of a rock and signals Scott to come over. Turns out the veteran was fishing with his grandkids. Before they start, Scott takes out an audio recorder. The old veteran then takes it from Scott's hand and throws it in the river. Takota then starts revealing that he loved the rush of war, but the encounter in Abilene made him think otherwise. Another blast from the past. A young Takota carries one of the wounded to safety. But on the way, he gets shot in the back. Meanwhile, many of the troops died one by one as they were picked off by their Vietnamese counterparts. Takota reports the situation through radio and calls for backup. That's when Takota witnesses William going down from the heli and starts taking charge and evacuating the injured despite taking heavy fire. Back at the river, Takota shares that he's the one who recommended William for the Medal of Honor. Takota further reveals that when a friend asked about the war, he just showed the nasty gunshot wounds on his back. Afterward, Scott continues with his job of tracking the others from Charlie Company. Soon, Scott arrives at Jimmy Burr's residence. Jimmy's wife, Donna, comes up to Scott and lets him know that Jimmy doesn't get up until 8 in the evening. Donna then explains that her husband has PTSD and 50 other war-related effects from Vietnam. Jimmy couldn't sleep during the night, hence, he sleeps during the day. Scott then asks Donna for the list of the men from Charlie Company that she tracked over the years. The political staffer falls asleep waiting for Jimmy. Later, Jimmy comes to his car to wake up Scott. After a brief exchange, Jimmy fires his gun to show the young man that his gun's loaded and starts getting agitated. The old veteran then reveals that he's been in service for 10 long years but hasn't fired a single shot until Vietnam. An unpleasant memory from the past. While patrolling the dense forest in Abilene, a young Jimmy starts a conversation with another soldier, and Lieutenant Takota scolds them to keep their eyes open. Not soon after, the Viet Cong ambush starts. Jimmy manages to get a kill using his shotgun. When the team takes a closer look, Jimmy starts puking after seeing the enemy corpse had its guts hanging out. Soon, Scott's back at the Pentagon. He asks his secretary what's the requirements for a congressional decorations package review. First, there must be a new eyewitness statement. Second, DoD report of casualty. And lastly, the chain of command endorsements. Scott has the first two but couldn't figure out what happened to the last one. The chain of command endorsements. Later, Scott meets up with another Charlie Company veteran named Ray Mott at the firing range. The veteran explains that shooting up things keeps him sane. Then he starts sharing his side of the story. Ray shares that William was part of the Air Force and shouldn't have been there. Nonetheless, the war hero stayed to help and fight alongside men he didn't even know. They continue the conversation in a school bus that Ray drives for a living. Back in the past, when Charlie Company gets ambushed, hundreds of enemy forces were crawling all over the place and up the trees. At the time, Ray knew that they were set up and didn't have a fighting chance. Scott plays basketball with Stanton and informs him about the missing command endorsement file. To get to know William a bit more, he visits the Pitsenbargers. They watch a few films, then William's parents give their take on when William joined the service. It got emotional when Frank went up to William's old room and started sharing his fair share of regrets. Something changed in Scott by the time he got home. He wondered how a man like William, who had everything, left home with such certainty that no bullet was going to stop him from who he was. Meanwhile, Dakota has a hard time sleeping and starts remembering the past. Vietnamese soldiers start looting the dead GIs. Knowing that they are entirely surrounded, Dakota orders his men to play dead and starts dragging dead bodies on top of them. Later, William calls out to the area to see if anybody is alive. Jimmy responds. William encourages Jimmy to help him carry Dakota to safety. The brave airman gets hit in the shoulders but continues to carry the lieutenant to safety and patch him up. In the middle of the night, Dakota calls Frank but can't utter a word. Instead, Dakota grabs his car keys to visit William's grave. Back at the Pentagon, Stanton walks up to Scott and tells him news that he's up for a promotional interview. But Scott was hesitant and wanted to finish the Pitsenbarger report. During Thanksgiving, the Pitsenbargers visit Scott and his family. Later, Dakota pays Scott a visit as well. The veteran hands Scott a new audio recorder and then presses the record button. Dakota then reveals that he made a crucial mistake when he radioed for artillery support. He admits that he got the distance correction wrong, and it led to friendly fire, killing a few US soldiers. And for years, ever since, that 20-second mistake has haunted him. Scott continues to review the audio recordings of his interview to further look for clues regarding the command endorsement that was filed 32 years back. One name always pop up, Kepper aka Sergeant Jonesy Kepper. With no other choice, he visits the man in Vietnam. Soon, Scott journeys deep into the beautiful countryside of Vietnam. He soon reaches Kepper's humble jungle abode. Kepper then shared that he wasn't religious, but when he prayed for a miracle during the Abilene encounter, and it was answered in the form of William Pitsenbarger. Kepper was heavily injured, but William kept his cool despite the chaotic scene and helped him. Kepper further reveals that the person who came up with Operation Abilene was the company CO, Mad Matty Holt. Also known as Colonel Holt. Presently known as Senator Holt. A big shot that might become the Secretary of Defense someday. Kepper shows Scott around the area. He currently makes a living by helping vets to immerse in the past by changing their perspective. Change the bad memories into good ones. Kepper then shows a beautiful greenhouse he made with tons of beautiful flowers and butterflies. Turns out, the conservatory was the place where William Pitsenbarger came down. There in Abilene. Scott gets teary-eyed, and lets go of all pent-up emotion within him. A beautiful spiritual awakening of acceptance. During Operation Abilene, the US grunts were surrounded from all sides. After fixing up Ray, William hands a letter to Ray and tells him to send the letter to someone in case he doesn't make it. William then takes off his jacket and covers Ray with dead bodies. The brave airman then continues to find soldiers to help but gets shot multiple times in the process, killing him instantly. Days later, Scott breaks into Stanton's office and finds the chain of command endorsement he's been looking for. And the whole conspiracy was revealed. The real reason Stanton hid the recommendation letter was because Operation Abilene might come to light. It was one of the bloodiest times during the Vietnam War, and this failure might affect the senator's reputation. Stanton's job is to protect the senator from such scandals that his political enemies might use, and so, Stanton gave the job to Scott, thinking that he'll never take such a mediocre assignment seriously. Scott decides to keep the files and include them in his findings, but Stanton threatens him that he will ruin Scott's career. The day of Scott's promotional interview came. During the interview, Scott wasn't as pumped. He desired no position unless he finished what he started. Scott intentionally flunked the interview so that he could continue with William's Medal of Honor recommendation. That evening, Scott meets with Tully and shares his fair share of trauma. He's trying to help Tully by forcing the veteran to own up the pent-up feelings he couldn't convey to anyone else. At first, Tully gets aggressively defensive but soon breaks down. Tully admitted that he was glad that it wasn't him who died and that he was ashamed for feeling that way. The following day at the country club, Tully and Scott pay Senator Holt a visit unannounced. Nonetheless, the senator welcomes them, and Scott then fills in the details to the senator about what happened. The senator admitted that he doesn't know how the recommendation fell out of the cracks. There are various reasons, but he'll see to it. At the Congress, the senator tries to convince everybody present to get William the posthumous Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor during the Vietnam War. The opposition shuts down Senator Holt, and the chairman closes the case. Scott goes home defeated and shares the details with his wife. But his wife encourages him to take a leap of faith. Later, Scott meets with Secretary Peters to report his findings and decides that he'll go public with the story. Peters tries to warn Scott that he'll be treading in deep waters, but either way, Peters will support him. Scott goes live on television and accuses the senators and staffs of playing political football on military valor, and it gets nationwide attention. Months later, the president signed the bill approving the posthumous awarding to the late William Pitsenbarger. Soon, veterans from the war and everybody involved goes to the awarding ceremony. Ray hands the letter that William gave him 32 years ago to its rightful recipient. Moments later, Secretary Peters hands the Congressional Medal of Honor to Will's parents. The movie ends with the secretary then recognizing the war veterans of Operation Abilene for working for years to see this day come. The veterans stood up. The secretary also calls for the para-rescuers from Williams' unit, war veterans, and everyone involved and affected by the actions of one man to stand up. After the ceremony, Frank hands his son's watch to Scott. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this and to help the channel grow.